Welcome to our Tuesday, April 7 live stream, BP oil spill survivors tell their stories. I am your host, Dr. Riki Ott, the founder and director of the ALERT project and a survivor of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. ALERT is hosting a series of live streams on Tuesdays between March 24th and April 21st to mark the memorials of our nation's largest oil spills. Next slide. This includes one most people don't know about, which is the 2010 Enbridge pipeline tar sands oil spill into the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. At 1 million gallons, it is still the largest tar sand oil spill in our nation. And it was also the most expensive cleanup on record at $1,185 per gallon. We'll get into the reason why at the end. These live streams are firsthand accounts from frontline survivors of disastrous oil spills. The stories of harm and loss also show what needs to change, what must change to minimize harm during oil spills during the next big oil disaster that could be in your backyard. Our national contingency plan for oil spill response is 26 years old. It is outdated, unsafe, and it endangers lives, as these witnesses can attest. ALERT is calling for national solidarity with oil spill survivors to demand accountability and system change. We are launching the hashtag What's the Plan EPA campaign to better prepare and protect citizens, communities, and tribes for the next oil chemical disaster. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our campaign and the fundraiser after our panel. So, what happens when emergency response plans are outdated? Well, people get hurt, and some people step up to provide local leadership to minimize harm to themselves, their communities, and others. Today, in episode 2, we are joined by Emily Harris, a longtime advocate of public health who will share some of her experiences working with remote area medical volunteer corps during the BP oil disaster, and her experiences with the 2013 Exxon Pegasus pipeline tar sand spill in her own state of Arkansas. Lori Bosarge, a mother and grandmother who was sprayed directly with Corexit dispersant at a public marina, has suffered long-term harm to her health since this exposure. And finally, we are also joined by Captain Lori DeAngelis, who ran dolphin viewing charters before and after the BP oil disaster in Western Florida. She carries the story of the Perdido Bay dolphins, as well as her own life that ran aground after the disaster. So we're going to start with Emily today. Emily, we met during the BP disaster in Clackamas Parish, Louisiana. You were a volunteer at the time with the Remote Area Medical Corps. This is sort of like a pause in our lives here. How did you come to be a RAMS volunteer? Let's go back in time first.
All right. I was working at the Arkansas Department of Health, managing a CDC program for improved community health assessments. And I was very much aware of what had happened with the disaster in the Gulf and BP, and was very concerned about the outcome on the community. So when I saw the request for volunteers be put out by RAM, I decided that I wanted to go. Remote Area Medical is part of the National Disaster Medical System, of which I am a federal intermittent employee now. At the time of the BP spill, I was just a volunteer with RAM, but I went with them as operations officer, and they set up on site and provided 3 days worth of primary care and dentistry and vision services to the community. So we saw lots of people that hadn't had access to primary care since prior to Katrina, when the local hospital and health clinics were basically devastated. So I was able to see firsthand, up close and personal, those health effects on the community. Some of them were more painfully obvious than others. Some of them were really not even sure of the total outcome now, as 10 years later, we're still addressing some of those issues.
Okay. When we met, you explained to me, we talked, you were a little upset about only offering primary care when you were seeing so much else going on. So let's back up a little bit to the June 2010 public meeting of health experts, public health experts, that was hosted by the Institute of Medicine. It was in New Orleans, I believe. And what was known at the onset, these public health experts knew that there was going to be exposures to oil chemicals on a massive scale.
Yes. The National Center for Disaster Preparedness was part of that large gathering of academics, government employees, researchers, and they all got together to try to understand the effects of oil spills on human health. There were representatives from every state across the Gulf. And although Arkansas wasn't represented strongly at the meeting, we were there in an audience. I was able to share those live broadcasts out across the health department video network. I was very concerned because the summation, the main vocal decision at that time seemed very clear to me that pregnant women and young children were very much at risk for long-term health effects from the air quality that the community was being submitted to, the toxins that were in the air, so that they should be evacuated. I was ready to help open shelters in Arkansas, but that wasn't the case. There were no, long-term evacuations. The infrastructure was still quite solid, and there was no reason to move that amount of people, even though we knew their health was at risk.
So I've also, in hindsight, read that report and others, but what Emily is specifically referring to is that there were ongoing air monitoring studies in southeastern Louisiana between May 1st and the very end of September. And this meeting was in June. They already had about 6 weeks of data. And that data was clearly showing that the air quality was over the unacceptable high cancer risk level set by the Clean Air Act. And it was enough that should have caused people to communicate the risk and to take action, to take preventative action. And none of that was happening.
And to actually leave the area.
And actually,
leave the area. Yeah.
Leave the area. And we're talking about oil spills as hazardous waste operations. So this is a hazardous waste operation now along the coast, and people were not told of the risk. Really,
and we experienced the same thing in Mayflower with the Exxon Pegasus pipeline rupture. People were not informed that there was a risk to their health and asked to leave until way later than they should have been.
Okay, hang on. I just want to, right before we jump to Mayflower, I want to add one other point, is that these health experts, 2 points, knew of what the symptoms would look like. They had tables, and we will make these available to people. It's in the report. It's tables 3-1 and 2, saying a whole list of the characteristic symptoms from other oil spills, respiratory problems, central nervous system problems, the headaches, the dizziness, the nausea, the skin rashes, the lesions. This was already known. Nosebleeds, the blood, the bleeding out of the ears and the nose. Yes, thank you. And they had a similar table of characteristic symptoms of exposure to oil spill dispersants, the chemicals that are used. So it was well known. So that was one point. And the second point was, what did these experts all decide to do? They basically stepped down. They said, this is going to be too big for us. We'll follow it long term. We're going to put our money and effort into long term.
Well, and the driving interventions were for mental health. There were community clinics that were set up quite rapidly to be able to screen people for mental health issues, with those sort of medications being easily prescribed. It was to combat the increase that was seen in substance and alcohol abuse and domestic violence. Common sense tells us that if you're living through a disaster and have lost your health and income, that there will be adverse side effects. So the way that was dealt with was through mental health clinics and mental health medications to try and help people calm.
And people were really not told that this could affect your health for the rest of your life. It could shorten your life. It could kill you. All these exposures, nobody was told that. So with that, I want to go to your personal experiences with the Mayflower spill, which would be the next slide. Because this, to me, our national contingency plan is really geared for oil that floats. Tar sands oil does not float. And I was shocked to see very similar health issues in both of these cases. So Emily, share with us the Mayflower the Exxon disaster.
Well, let's talk about these photographs. The top one is an example of hired off of Craigslist temporary labor, usually young men of color that were not informed about the dangers of their cleanup work. What he's wearing is a raincoat, not necessarily PPE. You see that that's a residential community cul-de-sac, and the paper towels and absorbent materials that were used to try and soak up that heavy dilbit were then loosely tied in trash bags and piled up, were left in open trailers, so that as far as the cleanup work went, not only were the workers at higher risk because they weren't properly informed or protected, so was the community due to the lackluster performance, their inability to try and capture those toxic materials and remove them from the vicinity. They didn't really want to accept the fact that there was the potential of harm through inhalation and just air quality issues. The much publicized avenue of harm was through physical contact. The majority of the financial compensation for affected parties were those that actually had physical contact with the dilbit, even though you could be separated by something like a garden fence and have increased respiratory rashes, nosebleeds, all those things we talked about, obvious health effects from exposure to the air quality issues, and still be considered not affected. So the bottom picture is of them actually tearing the houses down that had the dilbit underneath of their foundation, because no matter how hard they attempted to try and remove that from the soil, it wasn't possible for them to get underneath the foundation of, I think it was 5 or 6 homes. So they actually demolished those.
I think ultimately it ended up being 22 homes over time, especially in one of the Northwoods neighborhood. And this, people really didn't expect oil spill to cause this kind of harm. But this is in fact what happens. The air quality, which our outdated national contingency plan does not address, no touch, no foul. Air quality does not count as an oil spill harm yet. All right, but this is in fact what affects people. Through the air, the hydrocarbons come into your home and absorb into the curtains, into the carpet, into the furniture, into the clothes, into the kids' toys, and it really it's a problem that needs to be acknowledged, because this is not a safe situation. In Mayflower, the children at the elementary school, which was downwind and downstream of this disaster, started throwing up. And EPA came in along with Exxon and they took air quality measurements up at the ceiling. Well, the kids weren't breathing the air up at the ceiling. They were sitting at their desks. And EPA concluded that the levels were not high enough. So the kids must have all had food poisoning. Well, this is another problem here where we have standards that are outdated and there's evidence of harm, but because the standard is set here and the air quality is higher, well, gosh, people should not be having harm, so we cannot take action. We need to say, if there's evidence of harm, we need to take action, like what Emily was talking about. You see the rashes, you see the nosebleeds, you see the dizziness. You say people are getting exposed. We need to get them out of harm's way, especially vulnerable populations. But at these levels, we're all vulnerable. These are extremely toxic levels. So, okay. I was at Mayflower. I came in, happened to be in Texas at a tar sand blockade rally of all things. And I just crossed the state line into and joined the town hall meeting. Wait a second, before the town hall meeting, I think we've got the next slide, which shows what the Faulkner County Citizens Advisory Group did. So have an explain what these groups are and what happened.
Okay, we were in the perfect position. It was like the perfect storm for the Faulkner County Citizens Advisory Group. We had come into existence a few years before to try and address the rise in air pollution related to the shale gas industry. Faulkner County is in the Fayetteville Shale area, and we had a tremendous amount of not only pollution, but earthquakes occurring due to the fracking activity. So through Earthways and the Center for Environmental Health and the Bucket Brigade, we received funding and training and equipment to do our own air quality sampling. So our intention originally as the Citizens Advisory Group was to address the air quality issues from that fracking activity. However, one of our members who was trained and equipped and skilled actually badged in through incident command at the Mayflower disaster site and took her bucket to ground zero and captured an air quality sample that was then processed that came back with incredibly high levels of these long-term dangerous health air quality pollutants. And April Lane was there to capture it, and we were able to use this data. Dr. Wilma Subra came up. We actually had those town hall meetings every month for a year and helped interpret the air quality analysis and the effects on the community. And part of the problem is because, like Dr. Ott keeps saying, these standards are outdated and are not evidence-based. So the numbers are that they're suspect. They may be true for a healthy worker for 8 hours a day, but when the children in the community are subjected to them for 24 hours a day, it's a totally different ballgame.
One really easy way to explain this is if your family has a cold, you know how it is. One person gets it and then next thing you know, the whole family has the cold. So the parent goes to the store to buy some cold medicine for the adults and different cold medicine for children. And that's because children need a lower dose because the adult dose could actually do harm. And that's what Emily's referring to here, is that the children were getting an adult dose of these poisons. Emily, before we go to the town hall results, could you just explain what is a Citizens Advisory Council, a group in your case?
As my work as an Arkansas state employee at both the Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Health, and Emergency Management, I had occasion to work with a number of federal organizations, including the EPA. So I was eligible for some specific training through them. And part of that training dealt with Superfund sites and the interaction that the National Environmental Protection Act requires of health education for the community and their involvement and notification of the processes that are occurring are at a Superfund site. So there's actually, policy guidance and funding to help support the creation of those groups in the community, the community advisory group. So it's local citizens, and you would hope for representation not only from just homeowners or people that work in the community, but also your local hospitals, educational facilities, business people. So you'd have a holistic representation from the community so that everybody's needs could be addressed by that group and the effects of the Superfund site. So we started that Faulkner County, and we were in a great position to be able to apply that citizens advisory group organizational structure to this situation as well. So I highly recommend Riki and the alert programs efforts to train and build up community groups, and we're certainly here for you, that if you need some assistance with that, that's what we do best.
And we're going to be talking more about that as we, as part of our campaign, is building local capacity. And this definitely includes the citizen advisory groups and councils. So the very next slide shows what were the results of these town halls with citizen input at a very local level. How do we improve future disaster response like this?
Absolutely. Having the Exxon funded entities involved in the assessments of the community and ecosystem health was certainly a conflict of interest to anybody that bothered to look. And we still really need to push for that responder and cleanup worker protection. Like I said, it was typically young men of color, and they were not issued adequate equipment or training. And I know that it happens very often in these kinds of situations. Marking the areas would have been really helpful. Training healthcare providers. If this information isn't being shared through either continuing education for healthcare providers or as part of their basic training, they don't get it. They don't understand. It's not part of what they are trained to look or think about. And then obviously more public education and the wildlife response, because they also are going to be adversely affected.
And what Emily is talking about here is something that the Alert Project wants to address, is that our national contingency plan is very much top-down management, and oil spills don't happen at the national level or at the regional level. They happen in people's backyards, and people are the best experts of how to protect our own backyards and what we need to do that. And so that is something that the Alert Project wants to build nationally. And as we move forward. So thank you very much, Emily. We can go actually to all panel for a sec, so I can introduce Lori, Lori B. She's going to be called Lori Bosarge. So Lori and I also met during the BP disaster. I want to show the next, well, actually not quite yet. Yeah, okay, the slide, so we can sort of place Lori home. Last week we were in Louisiana. This is our virtual panel here. And now we are on virtual tour. We are in this little spot of coastline around Mobile Bay, essentially. Coden on the left side is in Alabama. That's Lori's home and backyard. And across Mobile Bay, down at the bottom of this map there, you see Perdido Bay. And that's going to be Captain Lori when she talks about that. So we have East Bank and West Bank stories here from Florida and from Alabama. So Lori B, we can go back to full screen right now. Why don't you share a little bit of what you did? We're just ordinary people, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a huge disaster in literally your backyard. What did you do before this BP disaster? How did it transform your life? What did you do during it? I know, right? Oh, not yet. Just stay on. Yeah, all panel's fine.
Well, before the BP disaster, I had a thriving embroidery business, local and across the states, and also my husband and I did a lot of wood crafting. Enjoyed that, building building things together. Of course, all of we do outside, and um, that's what we did before the BP disaster.
Yeah.
When the disaster hit, early in May is when we started hearing airboats running up and down our waterfront here. I live less than a half a mile from the water, from the Gulf, and we had no idea what was going on except that there was an oil spill, and we were told that there was no sight of any crude oil on our beaches or even near our area. We would watch these airboats, and as they would go from Codian down to Dolphin Island Bridge and back, within 15, 20 minutes, our throats would start getting sore, our eyes would start burning. We didn't really understand why, because there was never any warning. And this was in May of 2010, right after the oil spill. We live in a house that my husband grew up in. It's been in the family since 1946, and we moved here in year 2000. So we had been well established here.
When did you direct the Coastal Response Center? That was before the BP disaster? That was already up and running?
Yes, the Coastal Response Center was in Codian it was started in 2007 after the Hurricane Katrina. The Codian area was not recognized and did not get a lot of help. The residents didn't. So we came together to form South Bay Communities Alliance, and we're still operating today, serving our community with outreach, and we're all volunteers there.
Okay, cool. So you, as a citizen, were wandering down at the public marina one day when you happened to come into contact with something horrible.
Yes, I loved photography, so I was always taking pictures. And during the disaster, they had the BP command center set up in Codian and in Viola Battery on the different bayous. I went down to one of them. We were told in July of 2010 that they weren't using the toxic dispersants, and I went, and also after that little tropical storm Bonnie that we didn't even get any rain from. BP took the initiative to break down all of their command center there, saying they were practicing for a hurricane. They never set back up. The only thing they set back up was a decontamination booth, which had containers on it, and the guys were using pressure washers to wash down trucks, pickup trucks, things like that. I got out to take pictures because we were told that they weren't using any of the toxic dispersants. And as I was taking the pictures, one of the guys actually used with the pressure washer, sprayed, and when he did, he covered me with the spray. I was not close to them. It had to be. I wasn't close enough that I should have gotten sprayed. In other words, I was at a distance. Within 2 hours, my arms broke out red. My pores were all swollen and blistered. Anywhere that I had my skin exposed, my face was just red. And I didn't understand what caused it. I was so naive. I was like, wasn't out in the sun that long. I knew it couldn't be a sunburn, but I wasn't sure, what it was.
And when did you finally go to the hospital?
Well, that was in 2010. From that, it started, different things started happening. I started having eye drainage. One eye would tear. It didn't burn. It wasn't pink. It would just start running like I was crying. I had dizziness. I had um, brain fog. Had pressure behind on my head. It wasn't a headache. It was like a pressure. I'd had pressure behind one of my eyes. And this rash started coming up. That in February of 2011, I came home from out of town. When I go out of town, I stay to visit family. I came home. I was fine and feeling good. The next morning, I woke up with extreme wheezing. I had a lot of phlegm in my bronchial tube, coughing excessively, heartbeat rapid. And from my experience from trying to contact doctors in the area for help for me and other residents, and even the Mobile County Health Department, just talking to the director there was no doctors that were, I don't want to say take interest, but they would not communicate anything about if you were exposed to the oil or to the dispersant. They would treat the symptoms, but they would not get to the cause, and there was not communication with that.
Let me just jump in and explain what was going on. At the time, there was no official coding for chemical illness. Other countries had already adopted the updated coding that the doctors and the insurance company uses, but the US had not. And the US did not adopt it until 2015, well after all the claims had been processed. So for all intents and purposes, chemical illness was invisible during the BP disaster on paper. So the doctors did not provide written diagnoses of it, but they knew what was going on because they knew about chemical exposures. They also, though, knew that they couldn't treat it because they wouldn't get reimbursed for it. So when you say doctors treated the symptoms, what they treated was, multiple rounds of antibiotics, which will do nothing for a chemical illness. Illness is chemical causation. Antibiotics work for bacteria and mold and things like that, biological causation. So the skin rashes were being treated as not rabies, as regular skin rashes. Scabies rhymes with, yes. Okay. Scabies, which is highly contagious. And I know people who lived in families and said, this isn't scabies. Nobody else is getting it. I mean, everybody should have this if I have it. So colds and flu, heat stroke, food poisoning. You only have, anyway, the symptoms were being treated for something that was being misdiagnosed is the bottom line. So what happened? Did you get better? No. Yeah.
So some of the other symptoms that came up were like I said, fatigue, loss of words, my speech slurred. I could leave it. I could be driving through an area and all of a sudden not realize where I was. These things progressed up till July of 2011, where on my leg I got a small little blister, and I didn't know what it was. And within 4 days, it actually just grew or just enlarged from almost my ankle to my knee, and it was just raw flesh. It did not burn. I had no skin on on my leg, and it was draining on the floor. It was so bad, and it did not have any feeling whatsoever. I went to the ER. They admitted me immediately. Um, I was in the hospital for 8 days. I had infectious disease doctors there at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. They did 6 biopsies. The final one went to the CDC. I had asked them please to have them check for unspecified toxins, petroleum, heavy metals. I asked the infectious disease doctors this. When it came about, they told me that they didn't have the opportunity to do that at the CDC because the samples were already liquefied. And that's what I was told. I don't know anything about science. I don't know anything about doctors, but that's what they told me. I was very upset. While I was in the hospital, the blister, the only thing they did to my leg was to pour saline on it and keep it wrapped. I was on IV, but the rash turned into blisters all through my torso and my extremities. I can remember my friends that would come in and to visit. One took pictures one day, one took pictures the next day. My husband, of course, came and visited me every day. When months later, when I saw these pictures that they sent them to me when I needed them, I was shocked that anybody could even come in the room with me because that was so truly disgusting looking. And the smell that was going on from those blisters oozing was horrid. I mean, I couldn't stand it myself. And the diagnosis through the hospital, they called, said my leg had cellulitis and that the skin disorder was pemphigus. That's what that was the diagnosis. Well, after I had 6 weeks of in-home nursing care, they would come in 3 times a week. They would dress my wound on my leg. The swelling was staying up. And every one of the nurses that came in said that it did not look, they've never seen cellulitis like that. And usually they'd ask me how I got burned. That's when they would see. And it didn't hurt when they were dressing it, cleaning it, wrapping it. They were there for 6 weeks, and I had told my husband that was in the end of August, September. I told my husband that my sister has a doctor. He's 500 miles from here that said that he could test me for chemical exposure and toxins. And we put it off, because of the expense and the distance. But I had told my husband, I was like, we have to do this because I was afraid that if I had another setback with my health, that either I was going to lose my leg or I was going to die.
So we can go to the next slide and go ahead with your story. Ultimately, yeah.
So I did go to this doctor. He is a holistic homeopath doctor. He's been in my family for over 25 years, taking care of my sister's family. He was able to test me. He's also a kinesiologist, and he tested me positive for petro and petrotoxins. He started me on 1 drop. It's like an anti-venom if you were bit by a poisonous snake. It is an anti-venom for chemical exposure. He put 1 drop under my tongue, explained to me that my body will react in a way like I was feeling months ago, because the difference in regular pharmaceutical drugs is that the natural detox helps flush these chemicals out of your body, not just sustain what's going on in your body and keep them in there. So you're actually flushing out these chemicals. I have been continuously on the supplements since 2011, and my health has improved because of that. In 2013, I started having issues with my kidneys, and so I've been on a kidney drop since 2013. I have had my liver and my digestive system compromised. Of course, my lungs, my bronchial tubes, or respiratory, and I continue to take these supplements.
And I just want to interject here before we get to your next doctor, that the reason I invited Lori B is, one, because she was directly exposed to these dispersant chemicals that were sprayed in the air, underwater, that mixed with the oil, and basically everybody who was down there breathing the air, including me, inhaled this stuff and has had the symptom. A lot of people have had, hundreds of thousands of people have had the similar symptoms to what Lori is talking about. And these symptoms are not, well, okay. And now the longitudinal studies that are coming out, like the Coast Guard cohort study, for example, like the, there's 4 longitudinal studies. And basically what they're all showing are exactly the symptoms that of different systems of our body. So kidney, liver, blood, respiratory system, nervous system, that people are losing functionality over time because many people have not been properly diagnosed and treated. I consider Lori really lucky that she found this doctor and was able to afford the supplements for detox. So we're going to move the story from your supplements and getting better to why did your doctor recommend a SPECT scan, and what is a SPECT scan, and what does it show?
Well, in 2016, I started having some, swelling in the behind my ear, above my forehead. I could get an egg-shaped swelling on the top of my head. It wasn't like a headache, it was pressure pushing out. I also had, I'm gonna have to look here. I had my handwriting changed. I could wake up in the morning and have a slight nausea all day, just a little, but would completely forget to eat. It would be 12 hours later and I had not eaten all day. And even though my stomach was growling, I would wake up, and even though there was no headache, I could not stand any light. I could not stand any noise whatsoever. I had to be in complete darkness, and I started having eye twitching, and on my right eye only, and it would, and that went on for like 3 months. And then my left eye lid started twitching. All these things I took to my homeopathic doctor, And with all of this going on, also, I started waking up with my tongue being chewed up. But I couldn't figure out, I didn't put it all together until I started putting all of these symptoms. So when I went to my doctor, I gave him this list, and he recommended for me to go to Dr. Amon's clinic in Atlanta. He is a neurologist, and they do a scan that's called a SPECT scan. And the SPECT scan is it's a single photon emissions computer tomography. And what it does, it actually takes scans of the interior of your brain and the exterior of your brain. And also, I'm sorry, I lost my thought.
When you're resting and when you're active.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So this slide shows the exterior brain resting and active, and maybe you could describe the difference first between what is a resting brain and what's an active brain.
Well, the active is when you do a lot of excuse me, mental testing and challenges on the computer. You're working different problems, so your brain is highly active because it's just constantly working out these problems. Then that is when, after those activities, is when you have the SPECT scan. And the SPECT scan, it takes about 20 to 25 minutes, and of course you have to lay completely still. And then this is the scans that are from the exterior of the brain after the colors of the scan. These colors don't have any meaning whatsoever. It's just how they are when it's scanned. That's how they come out. If you look at the scan, let's see, I'm trying to see. Let's see, to the right, that's when I was awake, and the temporal lobe is it's lost some of its mass, and then also down at the bottom, the the parietal lobes, it's with the hole in it. This is what happens, well, due to the chemical exposure. And I forgot to say this about the SPECT scans. This doctor has performed over 100,000 SPECT scans, and with that quantity, what has there's a same pattern each time for people that have been exposed to environmental toxins.
Which is the next slide.
Yes.
And on the interior brain, I'm just going to move it along a little bit so that poor Captain Lori has some time.
Yes.
Basically, you were diagnosed with T65 toxic exposure because of this sort of diamond pattern in your resting brain scan, the interior. That is a common pattern that the neurologist, medical doctors see in these scans that they have associated now with toxic exposures, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So,
and as you can see, the one on the left is when I'm sleeping, resting, and that's when I was having my seizures. I have had, they are far and few between now. I have had them, but not like that I did in 2016 and 17 and part of 2018.
Okay, thank you for sharing your story. I think this story needs to be heard. These medical diagnoses are possible. I think more people are suffering from this than from these toxic exposures than what they know, because of they haven't been properly diagnosed yet. And the problem is, without proper diagnosis and treatment, the suffering continues. So we're going to go to, thank you, Lori, to Captain Lori right now. And we're going to go to the all full screen, all panel. And remember, Lori, Captain Lori now is on the east bank of Mobile Bay. And what did you do before the BP disaster and the Gulf spill, the BP spill?
I pretty much had everyone's dream job. I was a charter boat captain, and I specialized in like nature, birding, but mostly dolphins. And so that's my day consisted of going to work and getting paid for doing what all the tourists would come here and pay for. So I always felt like I was very, very lucky in that manner.
And you can actually continue doing that well into the BP disaster. You were on the water, on a boat. These dolphins tend to be home buddies. They have territories that are about 10 miles or so across. So you actually witnessed what happened to the dolphins, but in the meantime, you were also super exposed. So
Yeah, you know, everybody else was doing their VOO program, and so they, you know, all the other boats had been hired by BP, and they were involved in doing that. I was very much against everything and knew really the dangers. So I spent my time mostly taking out the media and talking to them, trying to, you know, make aware everybody what, you know, what was really truthfully happening, because you can hear it. Someone can tell you something about it, but until you actually see it and
did you hit something? So unless you actually see it and experience it, you can't really understand it. And then, so
yeah,
okay, there you go.
Your neighbor next door can tell you that, you know, whatever, she's got a bad skin rash, but you won't have any idea what it's like until you actually experience a bad skin rash yourself. So, you know, the general public was being told, you know, everything is okay. Y'all come on down to the beach. And those of us who lived here knew it wasn't okay. The little children shouldn't be playing in puddles of water made by the Gulf. And it was my effort to get the word out there. You know, obviously it was a little selfish because I didn't want to lose my career of being with the dolphins. They became like my babies after several years. So I wanted to protect them.
So
pretty much, yeah.
In being aware of this, you have, this must have been very stressful for you, because people who were watching the TV, your neighbors, your own son, believed that the beaches were okay, believed that the seafood was safe to eat, and took your children, your grandchildren down to these beaches. And I can't imagine how that must have felt as a mother and grandmother.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it wasn't convenient to be told that you could no longer really enjoy this beach town that we live in. So I understand why they didn't want to knowledge is power, but it can also be difficult to deal with because I knew exactly what the risks were. But my son would not stand beside me on that, would not agree. And therefore, yes, he was letting his children swim in the water. They were eating seafood and the whole, everything like everybody else was.
And I traveled up and down the coast and I saw other families with exactly these same quandaries. Who do you believe? Who do you believe? And
It
yeah,
caused a major problem, within the family, obviously, to the point where I really didn't see my grandchildren for 6 months just to let things calm down with their daddy.
but we're happy to say that your grandchildren seem to be all right.
Yeah, they really do. So far, everything's everything's fine with them. And obviously, I'm tickled to say that. My granddaughter is 13 now. One of the things that they saw, I believe, after the Valdez was miscarriages and whatnot. So we won't know until she gets, hopefully 6 or 7 years down the road before she has her first child, and we will be able to know. But there were several people that had a hard time carrying babies, right after they got pregnant right afterwards, and several of them did not carry the babies to term. So I hope that isn't anything to do. I hope they don't suffer that.
And what Captain Lori is talking about here is science that we know from the Exxon Valdez. This is 31 years ago, when the wildlife biologists and the medical doctors on completely separate tracks were realizing that oil is much more toxic than we thought when the Clean Air Act was passed, the Clean Water Act. And it is now the same as a definition of a toxic pollutant under the Superfund laws, where it can cause not only immediate diseases and cancers and death, it can also cause reproductive problems, not only in the exposed organism, human, mammal, fish, bird, it can also cause the reproductive problems in their offspring. So, why don't you, I have heard stories of unusual miscarriages. These data tend to get, because they were all coastal, they tend to get diluted by other data of the rest of the parish or the county. But what people experience in these coastal communities is very real. And also share about the dolphins, because I'm interested in the dolphins, because dolphins are mammals like us.
Yeah,
And
they will tell us, what's coming, the canary, so to speak. We don't have nearly as many dolphins as we did back then. The number has gone down. We've had several problems with them having skin lesions. I did notice after they had their babies that, like, they made it through. I noticed that the mothers started weaning their babies quicker so as they could get pregnant faster. I was very amazed by that. It was like they knew that they had lost population. So let's try to build that up quicker, because they will generally nurse a couple of years. And I was seeing them wean and train little tiny babies, a year to year and a half old, how to hunt and fish along with them, and the mother would stop nursing and gain another pregnancy. So yeah, it's amazing to have seen, but we really don't have nearly as, I would say, only 2/3, if that, of what we had before.
And what Lori is talking about, her observations are substantiated by NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration studies on the Barataria Bay dolphins, which are in Louisiana. There were also studies across the entire oil impacted coast, and the findings showed unusual cetacean mortalities of the common bottlenose dolphin. So the deaths were way abnormal for a good 4 or 5 years post BP disaster across the entire impacted coast, 4 states, Louisiana to Florida. The Barataria Bay dolphins, which were the ones most extensively actually studied by scientists, validate exactly what Lori is saying. The animals did abortions, aborted their young. They weren't able to carry them full term. They the babies died early. The adults were having liver problems, kidney problems, respiratory problems, lung problems, and it all really parallels the human story, strikingly so. So
that is
all right.
an unusual mortality event, and thank God dolphins are federally protected. So therefore, every time one washes ashore, it has to be taken to the lab, numbered, and they do necropsy to see if it's cause of death, if possible to get that. But that is called an unusual mortality event that began right, I believe, a few months before the oil spill. And at last I heard, it was still going on. I wish that I'd checked that out to see if it was still going on, because it's just the longest running unusual mortality event. It just continued to happen. I'm sure at least 6 or 7 years that it ran.
I'm going to ask you to all reflect on your spill experiences. And Emily, think about the Mayflower one for this question. And the question is, how many other people, I mean, do you know other people who in your area, in your region, that have these illnesses that are just keep on going from the BP disaster? So let's start with, well, Captain Lori, you're on deck. You're still there. So why don't you, and then we'll go to Lori B.
Okay. Yeah. Obvious ones, the coughing, ENT kind of, ear, nose, and throat things. I believe the doctor's offices around here saw a great influx of those that had that problem. Gastrointestinal problems, the miscarriages. My son-in-law was actually working the VU, and he got both of his legs severely. It was burnt. There was no fire around, but he was burnt. And the children, a lot of them were diagnosed ADHD. And of course, they just went, "Oh, it's got ADHD." They didn't put in there with that the child had that, probably due to the toxins. But they just kind of pushed that off on. They're not paying attention because we're upset about the oil spill, or it just runs in your family. So they just kind of get the poor babies. There's
So you're
a spike that happened in cancerous. I know several people that have died of cancer since. And then, of course, the one you just can't get around, which is the mental part of it. The depression that comes along with that.
Yeah. And Lori B., what are you seeing in your state, neighborhood, area?
Well, starting in the like 2015, there seemed to be just an extreme amount of death in the bayou. We were having 2 and 3 funerals a week. And where I live, just within maybe a quarter of a mile, we had 9 people die within 3 months in about 2015 or 16. And what I'm seeing continuously now is, of course, the cancers, but the kidney failure seems to be very high. I know quite a few people they're not elderly, they're not smokers, they don't have a alcohol problem, and they are on kidney dialysis, or they are in a stage where they are about to be on kidney dialysis. And these people live right here around me. Unfortunately, they don't have the doctor that I have that's been treating me back long before I ever knew I had the kidney problem. He diagnosed it. I didn't know it. And then babies are being born and they're having digestive, they're born with digestive problems, respiratory problems, um, just uh, and that's just mamas that were here and they were 10 years old during the BP disaster, and their parents did the cleanup. So um, it's a continuous illness, the continuous. Um, every time I hear somebody having a problem, I connect it to, did they clean, or did they work? Not clean, no, nobody cleaned, but did they work the oil spill? Did their husband work the oil spill? How old were they? And were they living in this area? And so the health issues are still extremely severe here.
And this is what I've seen. I've done 13 Gulf tours over the last 10 years. And it has been really striking to me that these illnesses and cancers, people remark on them over and above the background level of cancers and illnesses in this region, which is there's a lot of industrial pollution down there in this deep South area, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, for example. But people are saying this is over and above what we have experienced before. And the medical doctors, going back to that June 2010 meeting, could see this coming. And some of them actually did start long-term studies. But the trouble is, and these long-term studies are now confirming exactly what they expected. Where is the preventative side of this? How could we have gotten ahead of this train wreck? You can't really get ahead of it with a response plan that is using last century's 25-year-old science and technology. That doesn't work. That's why we're trying to update it. So Emily, what are you seeing from the Mayflower disaster?
Well, I think on the surface, we all want to say that it's fine. It's just fine, that we're all fine right now, right? But I think that we really can no longer continue to deny the long-term health effects of chemical exposures. We already have sufficient clinical evidence to talk about the multi-generational, the effect on our DNA and the genetic changes that come about from some of these exposures. And it puts us at risk. It makes us more vulnerable. You talked about that area being identified as Cancer Alley already, and the susceptibility to multiple long-term exposures. And then you have an incident like this where all of a sudden the levels in the community are spiked. We talk about that in the alert community training. We like it to a rain barrel, that our bodies are sort of rain barrels. So healthy adults have larger, more effective rain barrels than a baby or an older person would, and that we can only process certain amounts of toxins over certain amounts of time. So when we don't, we see those toxins outpouring with an increase, not only cancer, but other chronic long-term diseases. It's associated with the immune response and obesity and heart disease and diabetes and all these other issues that are shortening not only the length of our life, but also the quality of our lives. So it's like ignoring the elephant in the room. These environmental exposures are around us, and we need to be able to identify that they need to be evidence-based and not just metric-based. The changes need to come about in policy so that we can actually implement community health improvements to address them and improve the health of the community.
And what Emily is talking about is actually validated by the World Health Organization, of all things, which has now listed industrial pollutants as the #1 contributor to our body burden, our rain barrel, and chemical illnesses and disease in industrial nations. This has overtaken tuberculosis and malaria as a world health crisis. And this is in part largely preventable, okay? It's not only the disasters with these acute exposures where it's in your face that people are having problems and sick and are having long-term problems from these initial exposures, but these daily exposures, like from the frontline communities that live adjacent to petrochemical industry. This is drip, drip, drip in the rain barrel all the time. So what Alert is doing is launching a hashtag, what's the plan EPA campaign, specifically to better prepare and protect our citizens, communities, and our tribes during the next oil disaster, or in case you live next to one of these polluting industries already. We want to build local capacity, involve local governments, involve local citizens in protecting basically our own backyards, our own communities, our lives, our livelihoods. We want to specifically do 3 things as part of our campaign. One is to update our national contingency plan with 21st century science and technology. The whole plan, so that it covers things like unconventional oil, like what Emily was talking about, the tar sand spills, the frack disasters, oil that explodes, oil that sinks. It's not in the 26-year-old plan, okay? So we need the whole plan updated. We need better worker response and safety programs. And we're going to be talking in future episodes more about that. But as a part of updating the plan is also, we want EPA to finalize the current rulemaking on rules governing dispersant use. They're in limbo right now. As long as they're in limbo and not finalized, we use the old rules, unlimited amounts of these toxic chemicals on our oil disasters. That doesn't work. We want states to actually revoke dispersant pre-authorization. And allies like you who are listening are all critical to making this change happen. So we are running these live streams to show that these are real stories of real harm that happens when you don't have an updated emergency response plan. We are running fundraiser now too, along with the campaign and the live stream. And every little bit helps here. This is about public education material and community support to help communities develop these. How are we going to do this? Build these citizen advisory groups like what Emily has under the Superfund, or the citizen advisory councils under the Oil Pollution Act. How do we do that? Let's do this together. I have always worked as a volunteer. This is not to support my time or my work. I will continue to dedicate my life to this. This is to support my team, because I do the content. I do all the pretty social media and the graphics and, setting up these calls and planning. I need a little bit of help, and that's what a lot of this money's for. This is some dollars that are very well spent. And it's also to help out when we go on the ground and do these tours. It's to buy the food for the local trainings. It's to, help people with gas money to get to these trainings. It's that kind of stuff that the money would be going for. So I'm going to remind everybody that the recordings for these live streams are posted on our Alert YouTube channel. Please join us next Tuesday for episode 3. Share the invites with your friends. Come invite them to come hang out with us Tuesday, 10 to 11, a little bit later today. Sign up, please, on the Alert website to get these invites. Thank you, Emily Harris, Lori Bosarge, Captain Lori DeAngelis, for joining the panel this week. And thank you all for joining us. This concludes episode 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.